Imagine walking into your favourite Cornish woodland and finding mushrooms that glow like lanterns. Well, today here at Kennall Vale, that's exactly what we've come looking for. Welcome to the channel, thanks for joining me. So obviously there aren't really glowing mushrooms in these woods. There are some species of fungi, mushrooms, that do have a natural bioluminescence, and you can actually find them in the UK. However, they're quite rare and the light that they put out is pretty weak, which isn't a lot of use to us when we're looking to get images like these. So how do we take photos of glowing mushrooms? Well, the first thing we need is some mushrooms. So let's have a little wander around and see what we can find. And then hopefully I'll teach you how to make the magic happen. So after a bit of searching around, I think I found some mushrooms that will serve our purpose. Right up here on this tree. Thankfully for me, it's just within my reach. But the important thing with these mushrooms is that the cap is nice and translucent. Now, that means that when I shine the light through, we get a nice uniform light coming through the cap of the mushroom itself. So what equipment do we need? Well, you don't really need anything too fancy, in all honesty. A camera that you can manually adjust settings is a great start. I'm using my Canon EOS R. I've got my 24 to 105mm lens on there, which does have a macro setting on it. But, I mean, you can pretty much do this with most cameras. You will need a sturdy tripod because we're going to be focus stacking these images. So you don't want to be moving that camera around. I would advise using a 2-second timer when you're releasing the shutter. I said we're going to focus stack these images, so we're going to take a sequence of images right the way through, trying to get as much detail as we can in the base layer of that mushroom before we even break out the torch and put any light through. I've just been using that to check that actually I can get light through the caps, and I can, so that's fantastic. So the first thing we've got to do is to start setting up the focus stack, and we're going to take a series of images across the entire body of the mushroom. In fact, there's kind of 3 of them there. Because we want to get all that detail, particularly in the cap. And then when we've done that, we start putting the light through, we take some more photos, again another focus stack with those caps lit to get the detail again. And then hopefully we've got some nice sharp images to work with. So I've got those images in the bag. Hopefully I've got the focusing right. I tend to use autofocus with this because with so many shots I just find it's easier just to tap the screen where I want the actual focus point to be and just let the camera do the rest of it. Actually, the autofocus on this camera is very, very good, and as you'll have seen from the images earlier in this video, I use the autofocus with those, and it's done a fantastic job. So don't worry about using the autofocus, but like I said, a 2-second delay on your actual shutter release so that you avoid any shake. And just remember, when we are shooting these mushrooms, you've got to get low, because the detail is in the cap, so you want to be able to see the underside of the mushroom. And obviously we're going to put that light through the cap in a moment as well, and you want to be able to get that light when you're actually shooting these images. So that's the next stage. It's time to actually break the torch out and start putting some light through these caps. Okay, so this is where the fun begins. Got the torch out, and it's nothing special, just an ordinary torch. And all we're going to do is we're going to put some light through those caps. So if I kind of show you the sort of thing we're doing, you've got to be careful of the shrooms because you don't want to actually damage them. And all we're going to do is we're going to put the light through the cap there. I can put a little bit of light through the cap over here in a moment, and you've got that ambient light then shining down onto this third lower cap, which will be a nice soft light through there. And all we're going to do is exactly the same thing that we did just now with the focus stack, except we're only going to focus on the cap itself. So on the back of the camera, I've underexposed a little bit. So settings wise, I'm currently at ISO 400. I'm shooting at f11 and 1/15 of a second, because when I put this torchlight in, it's actually quite bright. So I've just reduced the overall exposure. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through again, and I'm going to do a sequence of shots around the cap with the light in there. I mean, that's another important consideration when you're doing this, is making sure you're actually in a position to reach the mushrooms and to be able to keep a consistent light on the image. But, and there I go, knocking the shrooms as I move the torch up there, look. But that's all I'm going to do, is just going to hold the torch up there. Don't worry about your hand being in there, because we're going to blend the light from these images into the previous focus stack that we did. So we don't need to worry too much about the torch being visible, a hand being visible, or anything else, because that's not going to appear in the final image. So I'm just going to rattle through a sequence of images here now, and I'll come back to you in a minute. Okay, so I've shot that sequence of images now, adding that light through the caps. I've had a quick review of those images on the back of the camera, looking through the viewfinder, and they all look sharp as far as I can tell on there. You might, when you're doing this, want to shoot a lot more images than you're actually going to need, just to make sure that you have got the sharpness right the way across the range, right across the caps and the mushrooms, the whole subject. We're not too worried about foreground or background. It is the subject that we're focusing on, and getting that focus stack just right so you've got enough images to use is really important. So now that we've got all of those images, we need to take those back to my house, back to the computer, put this all together, and let the Woodland magic happen. So here we are now, back at the computer. I've gone through and selected the images I'm going to want to use for this particular edit, and I've put those into a separate file because it just makes it easier for me to find them in a moment when I want them. So with everything in place, all that remains really is for us to dive into this edit, and let me show you how I actually produce these images. Okay, so we're going to jump straight into Photoshop. Now, I know a lot of these sort of tutorials jump into Lightroom, select the images, and then you end up coming to Photoshop anyway. So I'm just going to work in Photoshop, which is what I tend to do. So the first thing that we need to do, having shot all those images down in the woods, we now need to stack those images together here in Photoshop. So what we do is we go up to the top left corner and click File, drop down to where you see Scripts, Load Files into Stack. When you click this, another little box will open. Now you can click Browse. Now I've already selected some of the images that I want to work with, and I've put them into another little file. So I'm going to select those. That'll be plenty. Click OK. They are now loaded into there, and we can click Attempt to automatically align source images. And once you click OK, the computer will start the process of bringing those layers into Photoshop so that you can then work with them. So let's click OK, and hopefully this isn't going to take too long. So there we go. The computer's now started the process of bringing those files in, loading those layers, and you will see those layers appear down here in the panel on the right hand side of the screen. So my computer's a little bit old now, a little bit wobbly at times, so this might take a minute or two. So hopefully it's not going to, and we'll get through this quite quickly. So there we go. There's all of those layers now opened down there in that right hand panel. So what we need to do now is to blend those layers, and I tend to use the auto blend setting. So in order to do that, on my PC, I don't know what the button would be on Mac, but on my PC I click Shift and then click that top layer, and as you can see, that brings those up as a light grey. So that's selected all of those layers. Now if I go across to Edit in the top left corner and I come down to Auto Blend Layers, that opens this little box here where you can do a panorama or you can stack your images. Now I want to stack these, so that's already selected. I click OK, and again the computer just goes off and starts doing its thing, and what it will do is it will select the focus points from each image where it's nice and sharp and put the images together, and it will show you that in this layers panel over here in a moment when it's finished blending and aligning these layers properly. So let's see what it's going to come up with any second now. And there we go. Look, as you scroll down through those layers, you can see the little white bits where it's picked out the focal points that it's using. So I'm quite happy with that. So what I want to do now is I go across to layer in the top panel and come down to flatten image, and that will do exactly what it says on the tin, flattens the image down, so that we are now working with just this one file. Now you might notice that we've got this sort of white line, this white border down this side. It's nothing to worry about. That's caused by a thing called focus breathing, and that's where you've got the different depths in the image that you're focusing on as the focus picks its point. So you get this little bit of focus breathing as it moves in and out, basically. But that's not an issue because we're going to crop that out later anyway. We've got this mushroom up here, which I'm not going to want in the final image, so I will undoubtedly crop that. But because I'm going to be blending in some light in a moment from that torch, I want to make sure that the image is the same size to line it all up. So I'm going to go and save that a moment so that my computer doesn't crash and dump the file. So let's go into there and let's click that one, and we'll put Shrooms version 1. Let's click on that and we'll save that. There we go. So that's now saved, nice and safe. So the next thing we want to do is we want to open up the images that we're going to use that have got the light in them. So if we click on File and Open, and that brings us back to that focus stack image. Now, again, I've looked through these and I don't necessarily want to use all of these images that have got the light in them. So I've picked out a couple that I'm going to use. So I'm going to open that one, and that's going to come up. It'll open in Camera Raw. I don't want to do anything with it, so I'm just going to click Open, and that will open as another image on there. Look, just at the top. And then I'm going to go back there, open again, and I'm going to pick out that one and open that again. That will open up in Camera Raw. We're just going to open that image, and there we go. Now don't worry about the fact that your hand is in the image, that the torch itself is in the image, because those are not the bits we're interested in. What we're interested in is the light that's in here, and particularly in this image, this light in this room here. This one underneath I haven't lit, but I think the ambient light from above will just pick up through there when we actually come to do the full edit. So I'm not too worried about that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go across to File again. We're going to go back to Scripts. We're going to go to Load Files into Stack, but this time we're going to click Add Open Files instead of Browsing, and that will load those open files into there. Again, we attempt to automatically align the source images and click OK. And this time it shouldn't take too long because we're only dealing with the 3 images. So with a bit of luck, this will open quite quickly. Yep, there we go. There's those images. And again, you can see we've got that little bit of focus breathing just around the bottom of the image there, and a little bit at the top. Again, absolutely fine, not a problem at all. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to select the layer mask on that top shroom, which is this image. And then I'm going to go and select my brush tool and make sure that that's set to black instead of white. I might want to just increase the size of my brush a little bit, but not too much, I don't think. Let's try that. Okay. And then all we're going to do is we are going to start brushing in. I don't know where that's popped up from. We're just going to start brushing in this light just in here.
Obviously, there are certain areas that we've got to make sure we get into. We want to try and get as close to the edge here as we can. If you do go over, which I've just done on the top of that shroom, although I might leave it and come back to it in a minute, we'll see how it looks. You can switch that box here back to white, and that will basically remove what you've just done. So we're just going to do this. This takes a minute or two. So rather than keep you sitting there in silence, I'm going to crack on with this, and I will come back to you in just a moment. There we go. So I've painted in some of those areas that I want just to see where that light really is. I quite like that little bit of ambient light coming through the back of that mushroom just there. And there's a little bit of a glow in there. So I'm quite happy with that. So what I do now is, once I've actually done that bit, is we will go across. Let me just check that I have actually gotten to the very edge of those, because I'm not sure that I have. Not 100% sure. As you can see, I've just started to bring some of that torch in there, which I don't actually want. And one of the things with doing this with the mouse is that it's not always completely accurate. And you've got to be a little bit careful just around the outside of these things to try and make sure that it's all okay. But I think that's looking pretty good. I think that's looking pretty good. Probably if I had one of those pads with a pencil or something, it would be much easier, but I don't. So, but anyway, once I've got to that point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that image just there, that layer 2952, and then I'm going to press Shift and click on the shroom, which will highlight both of those. I can now right click on the mouse and merge those two layers, and that's merged that down. Again, what I do now is I go back, I put a layer mask onto the top shroom, I've still got my brush set up, and now I can start brushing in some of that other light, if I want to, across here, so that we can just start to pull that in a little bit. Like I said, doing this with the mouse can be a little bit tricky, and sometimes you do find you end up having to go back over particular areas. In fact, to be perfectly honest, sometimes I end up editing these images more than once to try and get exactly what I'm looking for. Here we go. Now we get some light coming in underneath this one. Don't like that. Let's take that out. I don't like that. Don't want that darker area in there. We want as much light as we can possibly get. And you'll notice that I've just managed to catch a little bit there. But I think that looks okay. I don't know if there is any ambient light in here, because if there is, I'd like to try and pull that in. There we go. Just a little bit of a glow in there. Don't like that, so we'll take that bit back out again. There we go. Try and get as much light in these areas as we possibly can. Now, I think that's looking quite nice to start with. I don't think there's any more light that I really want to introduce in there. We've got that ambient light coming through the cap of this base mushroom. We've got the two lights up here. There's no sign of a torch. There's no sign of my hand. I think we've got a little bit of ambient light in the background there. So I think that's looking quite nice. So again, I click Shift and hit the bottom one, right click, merge those layers. And now we've got just one base layer. Let's just go over to there, flatten that image down. I can now close these other images because I don't need them. But again, because my computer gets a bit wobbly, I am going to save those into the focus stack. Just make it nice and simple, and that way at least, if anything happens now, if the computer decides it's going to crash, at least my work is saved. I haven't got to start all over again. So from here, I would click Filter, Camera Raw, and now we've got this image in here to work with. And hopefully, when we zoom in, we'll find that we've got something nice to work with. Looks pretty good to me. Sometimes when you do this, you find that there are little insects and things in there, but not today by the looks of it. So that's looking pretty good. So now we move on to how we're going to edit these images. So my editing process goes a little something like this. The first thing I do normally is to go down to the calibration, and that blue primary, I normally pull it across to 100%, and that just, for whatever reason, makes those colors pop. Next, I go to the color mixer, and I actually strip out all of the color in the image. What I'm looking to do is to get my image back to a nice black and white base that I can then build it back up. And I will bring that down ever such a little bit, maybe half a stop of light. Might go the whole stop. Let's have a look. Yeah, I think I'm going to go the whole stop. I like the background to be a little bit underexposed to give you the detail of that shroom. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring those whites back up a little bit, just to put a bit of glow in there. And I want to put a little bit back into the shadows and lift those blacks ever so slightly. Now you might notice we've got some little blue specks, we've got some little red specks. So the little blue specks are telling you where the darker, blacker areas of the image are, and the little red ones are telling you those highlights are a little bit blown out. We don't need to worry about that. We can deal with that in a moment. So in fact, I'm going to bring that back a little bit more. Next, onto the color panel, I normally bring the vibrance up to about +30 because I like a bit of vibrance in my images. I like a bit of color to pop in there. This mouse is not the best, I have to say. Into the effects panel. Now, I like to add a little bit of Gaussian blur just to give it a bit of the lighter areas, a bit of a glow. So I'm going to bring the texture up to a +12, and I'm going to take the clarity down to -25. When you introduce clarity, you do actually introduce noise and light to an image. So I'm just dropping that off a little bit because I want to soften that image. I don't want it to be too overpowering. Into the curve selection, and in here, those little red dots, for example, if I just pull down on there, you'll notice they disappear. And with the black ones at the bottom there, I'm just going to grey those ever so slightly. About +5 is fine, and they're gone. And then you can use the tools here to try and see whether you can give yourself a little bit more pop with that light. There we go. Look, that's just giving that a little bit of a glow in there, I think. The thing you've got to, I mean, it's personal preference, but I'm trying to just give them a bit of a glow. They're not car headlights. You know, the idea is that they kind of look a little bit like lanterns rather than spot lamps. So now we come back to the color mixer, and we can reintroduce color. Now I don't think there's any reds in there. There might be some oranges. Yeah, there we go. Look, got a bit of an orange glow in there. I tend to introduce greens back before I bring in yellows, because I find that the yellow can be quite overpowering at times, and it does affect the greens. And I think that's one of the things I've struggled with woodland photography when I've been editing images, is that balance between the green and the yellow. I think a lot of people do. I think a lot of people do struggle with that when they're editing their images. You can see, if you keep your eye on the greens there, you'll see how those greens sort of yellow up a little bit as I bring in that yellow. Now, like I said, this is about, we want to make these images glow. We don't want to overpower them. I don't think there's any, oh, look at that, there is. There's a little bit of blue in there. So I might just put a little tiny bit of blue in those caps, just to see how that looks. I don't think that's too bad. I think it's overpowering. And then, of course, we can move to the luminance. Now, those greens, I may well just drop those off a little bit. Not too much. And then we can have a look and see what we're doing with these. I might just bring the yellows up a fraction of the luminance. And I might just bring the orange up a bit as well. But I think that's starting to look quite nice. Now, I don't think we're going to need to do too much more with these, but this little one down here, I would like to try and introduce a bit more light. So I'm going to go across to the mask panel, and I think I'm going to take a radial gradient. I'm going to put that in there and try as best we can to get a good shape to that. Might be a little bit fiddly. There is a little bit of work involved in these, and people don't realise it. It's just there, I think. Now, rather than use the exposure, which a lot of people probably would, which is a bit of a blunt tool, I think you've got a couple of other options here. You can either go down to the effects panel and use the dehaze, which, if I obviously pull that down extreme, you can see what it does. So I might go down to about -15 there, and then I might introduce a little bit more white into that panel, just so that we're getting, there we go. So I'm not worried about this particular one glowing. The ones that I've lit are these two. That's where I want the light primarily. And I think that's looking really nice at the moment. The only thing I might do in there, that particular one, is I might just pull the shadows and the blacks up a little bit. Not too much. All of this is a bit of a balancing act. I mean, your photography in general is a balancing act, isn't it? So there we go. Just to be able to see enough detail in there without overpowering it, I think. And I think that is looking really, really nice. I don't think I need to do too much more in there, really. I would be tempted maybe to bring those whites down a little bit. Let's have a look and see what happens when we go to the color grading panel. Let's take the highlights to begin with and just pull those down a little bit. Midtones, what do we get in the midtones? Yeah, let's just see. If I pull those midtones up, you can see how it brightens it. As I pull the midtones down, you see how it darkens it. So again, a bit of a balancing act. We're just going to pull that light down a little bit. As I said, we want these to glow. They're not spotlights. Now I might put a little bit of warmth into those highlights. Normally about 50, around about +50. And then you can see that just starts to bring in a little bit of a glow. And also what it does is it just takes the edge off some of the brightness in here. Again, I might just put a little bit in the midtones as well, just to see what that's looking like. I think that looks quite nice, to be perfectly honest. Let's click on there. Let's put a little bit of blue in the shadows behind, and that will as well. You'll notice as I pull that up, you'll see that does affect the light in those mushrooms. So this is, again, you're not trying to overpower the image with it. You're just trying to get a nice balancing act in there of light and color. And I think that's looking really nice. I do think that's looking really nice. Although, let's just take that back out of there a little bit. I think maybe it's a bit too much. Maybe it's a little bit too much in there as well at +30. What do we think? I want it to look as natural as possible, even though it's not obviously natural. I think it looks quite good, actually. I Let's take that to about there. Yeah, so I'm quite happy with that. So I would probably now click on the OK. And as you can see, that's changed that image quite a bit. Now I want to crop this because, like I said, I don't want this shroom at the top up here. So I'm going to pull that down to just below where the stem of that other one was. We're going to pull this up a little bit. So we're making this more of a square crop now. I'll pull that edge in a fraction just to get away from that focus breathing. I think that's looking pretty good. In fact, what I might do is just take that back up a little bit, just to give a bit of breathing room in there. Pull this down here a little bit, because I quite like this little bit in here, but I'd like a little bit more room at the top of the image. So just there, I think that's looking pretty good. So like I said, I'd like to introduce a bit of Gaussian blur as well. So what I'll do now is I've got to the layer panel, smart objects, convert to smart object. Go back to there, smart object again, new smart object via copy, and that brings up a copy of that layer just over there. Go to your filter, go to your blur, and click on Gaussian blur. Now I've got the radius of the pixels set to 30.3, which is the same as my sensor on my Canon EOS R, so that it gives you a much nicer image when you've finished doing this. If you pop up then to the image and adjustments, brightness and contrast, we're at 50 for the brightness, 70 for the contrast. Then we come over to the panel over here, layers, channels, paths. So we go to the channels one, and we're going to click on these and just leave that blue one active. Come down here onto this little circle, click that, and what that does is it puts these lines around the light, so it's supposedly making sure that it identifies where the light is in that image. Come back to layers, go back to layer mask, and it looks horrific. So go to opacity, and what I tend to do is I pull that opacity right the way back and then start to bring that forward a little bit. I don't know if you can see that glow that starts to come in. I think 22 is a little bit too high. I'd probably wind that back to about plus 15. It's just about softening it and giving it a little bit of a glow rather than trying to overpower the image. So I'm quite happy with that. I'm going to flatten that down. There's a few more little tweaks I might make to this image. I mean, I might sort of darken some of these little areas here. But I think generally speaking, that is looking really nice. I like the way that's come out. I like the softness the Gaussian blur gives. So yeah, I'm just going to make those final little adjustments to how I like the image to look, and then I will pop that image up on the screen for you to look at. But that's basically how I create glowing mushrooms. So I hope you were able to follow that tutorial. I hope you got something out of that. I'm really pleased with that final image. I think it looks really nice. I think when you're out in the field doing this, if you intend to do this, you need to make sure that you shoot a lot more images than you're actually going to need. That gives you a broad range of focal points. You can go through those images, discard any that you're not going to use. The same when you put in the light through the mushroom cap itself. Shoot more images than you need, put as much light in as you need. You don't have to use all of those images. You can discard some of the ones that you don't want to use and just be selective in where you paint that light in. And also don't forget that when you're trying to shoot these mushrooms, you need to get underneath with the camera so you're looking up at the cap and that light coming through from the other side. Sometimes trying to isolate those mushrooms. Sometimes you see a mushroom, you go, that mushroom's absolutely perfect for what I want to do. And it's just not accessible. It's not easy enough to do. So it is just, it's your own personal choice as to how you do it. But I hope you got something out of that. I hope you like that image. And if you're going to go out and try this technique for yourself, I really would love to see your images, see what you come up with yourself. Tag me in them.
tag me in your images, and let's see what you come up with. Anyway, that's enough from here. Let's go back to Kennall Vale. That's it for another video, folks. If you found this video helpful, then please do consider giving it a like. Apparently it helps the algorithm to know that it's a video worth sharing with other people, so that would help the channel grow, and I'd appreciate it. But if not, great to have you along, great for you to come and watch the video. If you know, let me know in the comments below, have you tried light painting yourself? Have you done any kind of glowing shroom images? Have you got one that you'd like to share? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're new around here, why not consider subscribing for some future Cornish adventures? Anyway, there's a couple more shrooms over here on this bit of tree behind me that I might have a quick look at before I go home. And who knows, there might be some bonus images. Thank you for joining me. I'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you.